que hay más democracia actualmente en México que en Estados Unidos. Es porque aquí gobierna el pueblo, allá gobierna la oligarquía.
All across Latin America, leaders are speaking out against U.S. meddling and intervention in their internal affairs. And the latest example of this is a very powerful speech from Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO, AMLO. He is the first left-wing president in Mexico in many decades. And Mexico is, of course, a neighbor of the United States. Mexico and the US are each nation's largest trading partner. And despite that, AMLO has been willing to criticize the United States for trying to control his country and in meddling in his country's internal affairs.
Aprovecho para contestarle al Departamento de Estado del Gobierno de Estados Unidos que, como es la mala costumbre, siempre se inmiscuyen en asuntos que no les corresponden.
He gave this fiery speech in which he condemned U.S. State Department meddling, and he said, quote, "There is more democracy today in Mexico than in the United States, because here the people govern and there the oligarchy govern." He railed against U.S. elites.
Pero esto no es nada más el Departamento de Estado, es la naturaleza, la costumbre que viene de siglos en el gobierno de Estados Unidos y en las élites de Estados Unidos. Cuando hablo de que tenemos más democracia nosotros que ellos, es porque aquí gobierna el pueblo, allá gobierna la oligarquía.
He criticized the U.S. corporate media, and he said that U.S. newspapers like the Wall Street Journal are propaganda mouthpieces for the economic mafias that control the mafias of economic power in the world, is what he said.
El Wall Street Journal, 8 columnas y fotografía para la marcha de los corruptos, porque ese periódico y otros en Estados Unidos protegen a las mafias de poder económico en el mundo.
AMLO also criticized Washington for supporting a coup in Peru that overthrew Peru's democratically elected president, Pedro Castillo.
En vez de estarse metiendo, actuando de manera injerencista en nuestros asuntos, si quieren seguir con la misma política, pues que se ocupen de lo que está pasando en el Perú, donde ahí la embajadora de Estados Unidos es la asesora de los golpistas que pisotearon las libertades y la democracia en ese país, destituyendo injustamente al presidente y encarcelándolo.
Now, this year, 2023, is the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine. This is a colonial doctrine in which the U.S. essentially claims Latin America to be its imperial backyard, supposedly. And in response to that, President López Obrador criticized the Monroe Doctrine and said that the United States needs to move on from this 200-year-old bad habit, he said.
Todavía no abandonan la política de hace 2 siglos, la política de Monroe, de sentirse el gobierno del mundo.
So those were some very powerful words. So why did AMLO hold this press conference in which he was criticizing U.S. State Department meddling? Well, specifically, it was about the issue of electoral reform in Mexico. The government of López Obrador and his leftist party, Morena, has made one of their top priorities passing electoral reform for a few reasons. One, because of the systematic corruption and allegations of electoral fraud that are very reputable. There's a lot of evidence in past elections. They're trying to prevent that from happening in the future. Also, part of the proposed electoral reform is making voting easier for Mexicans who live in rural areas, especially in the South, for Mexicans with disabilities, for Mexicans living abroad. So it's about further democratizing the system. And this is really angering Mexico's elites, right-wing oligarchs, because they know that the right-wing parties of the PAN and the PRI they maintain power in Mexico for decades. The PRI party, PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, it governed Mexico from 1929 until 2000, uninterrupted. And then from 2000 until 2012, the right-wing PAN party, the Conservative Party, they governed from 2000 to 2012. And then the PRI party came back in 2012 after very serious and reputable allegations of electoral fraud, of stealing the election from López Obrador. And I'll get to that evidence because, again, it's very strong. So the point is that AMLO, who has a lot of support from the Mexican people, has made one of his priorities passing this electoral reform to prevent the right-wing oligarchs in Mexico from continuing to steal elections and maintain their chokehold on power. Now, in response to these protests that were held in Mexico against the electoral reform, that were organized by right-wing politicians who are deeply linked to corruption, electoral fraud, and drug trafficking, the U.S. State Department came out and basically expressed support for these protests and criticized AMLO for trying to pass this electoral reform. The CIA officer turned State Department spokesman, Ned Price, published a statement talking about the great debate on electoral reforms and said that the protests are part of supporting healthy democracy. Now, he was a little diplomatic with his language, but if you know the context of what's going on in Mexico and his comments about a well-resourced, independent electoral system and respect for judicial independence, it's clear that the U.S. government is publicly supporting these right-wing protests against the Mexican government's electoral reforms. So this is a blatant act of meddling in the internal affairs of Mexico by the U.S. State Department. That's why AMLO criticized Washington and pointed out that it has a long history of this kind of meddling.
Aprovecho para contestarle al Departamento de Estado del Gobierno de Estados Unidos que, como es la mala costumbre, siempre se inmiscuyen en asuntos que no les corresponden.
Now, while the U.S. government and basically every major Western media outlet is spreading this propaganda supporting the protests against AMLO and opposing his electoral reform, meanwhile, polls show that the vast majority of actual Mexicans living in Mexico support electoral reforms. This is a report that was published in Spain's newspaper El País, which is very biased against AMLO. But they admitted that the National Electoral Institute, the INE, published a study, a survey of Mexicans, and it found that between 74% and 93% of Mexicans support the reforms that the Mexican government is trying to push through, depending on the specific policy. So 93%, I repeat, 93% of Mexicans support AMLO's proposal to reduce the amount of public resources that go to political parties, because again, that fuels corruption. 87% support reducing the number of representatives in the federal system, so simplifying the electoral system, which is also part of AMLO's electoral reform package. 78% think that there should be elections so that the electoral counselors and magistrates are elected by the citizens. 78%. And also 74% support reducing the resources for the National Electoral Institute. Those are all policies that are part of AMLO's electoral reform. So again, between 3/4 and 9/10 of Mexicans support these electoral reforms, and yet the Western media coverage is 100% against the electoral reforms, and the U.S. State Department is supporting the 7% of Mexicans who oppose these policies, the tiny elite, the small elite class of rich, wealthy Mexicans. Now, furthermore, not only do the vast majority of Mexicans support these electoral reforms, but the study even found that 52%, slightly over half of Mexicans, support entirely getting rid of the INE, the National Electoral Institute, abolishing it and replacing it with an entirely new institution called the INEC, the National Institute for Elections and Consultations. Only 40% of Mexicans oppose that. So the point is that these policies that AMLO is trying to implement are extremely popular, and yet the Western media is trying to convince us that supposedly AMLO is a supposed dictator. In reality, AMLO is one of the world's most popular leaders and has consistently been so since he came to power in late 2018. This is the study done regularly by this US-based polling firm called Morning Consult, and they do approval ratings for global leaders. And consistently, AMLO has been one of the most popular presidents in the world with an approval rating of between 60 and 70% for the entire time he's been in power. The most recent polling from the last week of February showed AMLO with 61% support and 35% opposition. Compare that to Biden, 42% support and 51% opposition. Or Justin Trudeau in Canada, 39% support and 55% opposition. Or Olaf Scholz in Germany, 36% support, 59% opposition. Rishi Sunak in Britain, 32% support, 56% opposition. Emmanuel Macron in France, 28% support, 67% opposition. So the leaders of the so-called Western democracies are actually not democratic. In almost all of the Western so-called democracies, the leaders are opposed by the majority of the population. Meanwhile, these are the consistent approval ratings of AMLO since he came in going back to 2018, but this shows going back to 2020. I mean, it is incredible how consistent his approval has been. In December, he had 70% approval and 24% disapproval. And yet, the Western media, the US media, is full of so much propaganda demonizing AMLO because he's a leftist, because he's independent, because he opposes the US blockade on Cuba, because he opposed the US-backed coup in Bolivia and the current US-backed coup in Peru, because he nationalized Mexico's oil reserves, because he nationalized Mexico's lithium reserves, because he's a leftist and refuses to impose the neoliberal economic policies that were imposed in Mexico for decades. That's why there's so much propaganda against him.
Aquí es de definición. O con el pueblo o con la oligarquía.
And to understand really who AMLO is, we have to go back to understand the recent history of electoral politics in Mexico. Mexico was basically a one-party state. From 1929 until 2000, it was governed by the PRI party, which the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which had its origins originally in the Mexican Revolution, which overthrew the right-wing dictator Porfirio Diaz. But then after the PRI party came to power, it eventually moved to the right over time. And in the 1980s, it became completely neoliberal. And the PRI party today is a center-right neoliberal party. And they governed until 2000. And then in 2000, the right-wing conservative party, the PAN, which is a very hard right, far right kind of Republican Party style group, they came to power in Mexico and governed from 2000 until 2012. And then the neoliberal PRI party came back in 2012. And AMLO comes from the left. He was a leader originally of the PRD party, a left-wing party that was a split out of the PRI. And then he later formed his own party, Morena, a leftist party. And he's always been a representative of the working class of Mexico, an independent politician, challenging the bipartisan dictatorship and the corrupt neoliberal oligarchy that has dominated Mexican politics. And in 2018, he finally was able to come to power. But there's a lot of significant, reputable evidence showing that in the 2006 and 2012 presidential elections, AMLO probably won those elections, but the victory was stolen from him through rampant electoral fraud. And these are not accusations like, Donald Trump and the Republicans in the US, which have no evidence. They're completely baseless. There is a lot of evidence showing that the 2006 and 2012 elections in Mexico were rigged They were stolen by the right-wing and neoliberal oligarch forces, and that's why AMLO is trying to pass electoral reform to prevent future electoral fraud in Mexico. And that's why so many Mexicans, the vast majority of Mexicans, between 74% and 92%, support some of AMLO's electoral reforms. Now, the 2012 election in Mexico was one of the most blatant cases I've ever seen of electoral fraud. And AMLO himself publicly said that the PRI party, the neoliberal right-wing PRI party, that they bought 5 million votes to steal the election. And that is not just AMLO's accusation. Even the BBC, British state media, published an article and a video in 2012 admitting that the PRI party, there was video of people who the PRI party bought their votes. This neoliberal party, they gave them these cards, and then on the cards they put money on there so working class Mexicans could go buy, groceries and things. BBC published a video of this on their own website, and you can see these long lines of Mexicans waiting in grocery stores. And this is a clear example of electoral fraud admitted by mainstream corporate media. And AMLO would have won the election if it were not for that electoral fraud in 2012. But that's not even the only evidence. There's even more insane evidence showing how corrupt the Mexican electoral system is. And this is from an article that was published in Bloomberg back in 2016, and it's called How to Hack an Election. And it talks about a Colombian hacker who was a hardline right-wing anti-communist, anti-socialist activist named Andres Sepulveda. And he was hired by right-wing politicians across Latin America, in Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, to try to rig elections to prevent the left wing from coming to power. And he was hired by the neoliberal, corrupt right-wing president of Mexico, who came into power in the 2012 election, Enrique Peña Nieto. And Peña Nieto is from the neoliberal PRI party. And he was given $600,000 for a budget to this Colombian hacker. And he led, I'm reading from Bloomberg, this Colombian right-wing hacker, quote, led a team of hackers that stole campaign strategies, manipulated social media to create false waves of enthusiasm and derision, and installed spyware in opposition offices, all to help Peña Nieto, a right-of-center candidate, to eke out a victory. They said that when Peña Nieto won, in scare quotes, when he won the 2012 election, this right-wing Colombian hacker, Sepulveda, began destroying evidence. He drilled holes in flash drives, hard drives, and cell phones, fried their circuits in a microwave, then broke them to shards with a hammer. He shredded documents and flushed them down the toilet and erased servers in Russia and Ukraine, rented anonymously with bitcoins. He was dismantling what he says was a secret history of one of the dirtiest Latin American campaigns in recent memory. So Bloomberg refers to the 2012 election in Mexico as one of the dirtiest Latin American campaigns in recent memory. It was a clear example of a stolen election. And then they go into more detail later on in the article. He talks about how the left-wing candidate in the 2012 election was the candidate of the PRD, which now is no longer his party. It's now actually part of the opposition. And that was Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO. And what happened is this right-wing Colombian hacker, his team installed malware in routers in the headquarters of AMLO. So they were spying on AMLO, which let them tap the phones and computers of anyone working on AMLO's campaign, including AMLO himself. So this Colombian hacker working with the corrupt neoliberal right-wing president, Peña Nieto, they were spying on AMLO in the 2012 election. And then they said that when AMLO's team prepared policy speeches, the hacker had the details as soon as AMLO's speechwriter's fingers hit the keyboard. That means that he saw AMLO's upcoming meetings and campaign schedules before AMLO's own team did. They used high-end software to tap into Apple's phones, Blackberries, and Android phones. They created fake social media profiles, 30,000 Twitter bots. They spread fake news on social media. They had thousands of callers call with pre-recorded phone messages in swing states. I mean, they stole the election blatantly in 2012, not even considering the very reputable evidence of vote buying. So this is all well documented, and AMLO is a victim of this blatant electoral fraud. That is why he is trying to pass electoral reform, and that is why this electoral reform is so popular in Mexico. It's well known that Mexico institutionally has struggled with systemic corruption and especially electoral fraud. Now, Mexico is certainly not unique in this. There's a lot of ridiculous stereotypes, and the US certainly is a country with a lot of systematic corruption, which is basically legal. Bribery is legal in the name of campaign contributions or lobbying, which was made illegal by Citizens United that says corporations are people and giving money is constitutionally protected speech, so they can buy politicians. And in the United States, more than 90% of congressional candidates who get more funding in their campaign win the election. So I'm not saying Mexico is unique in this, but obviously Mexico has had a very serious problem with systemic corruption. And in recent presidential elections, there was blatant electoral fraud. In the 2006 election, AMLO technically on paper lost the election by about half a percentage point. He came extremely close, just about 250,000 votes shy of winning the election, compared to with 14.75 million votes compared to 15 million votes for the right-wing candidate of the conservative PAN party, Felipe Calderon. And AMLO has said, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's true, that the election was stolen from him, that there was electoral fraud. And by the way, Felipe Calderon, it's well known that this is the president who served from 2006 to 2012. He was a close ally of the US government, especially George W. Bush. He launched the so-called war on drugs, which was a complete disaster and led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. And it's well known that Felipe Calderon was and is linked to extreme corruption and drug cartels. He allegedly had his own personal death squad, according to his former government officials. In fact, the former Secretary of Public Security, the top security official overseeing the police in Mexico under President Calderon, his name was Genaro Garcia Luna, and he was just convicted in a U.S. federal court in New York for drug trafficking. And he was convicted of protecting the Sinaloa cartel and El Chapo Guzman, the most notorious drug lord in modern history, right? So Felipe Calderon, the corrupt right-wing oligarch who became president in 2006 and whom AMLO accused of electoral fraud, his chief of security was working with drug lords, with drug cartels. And a U.S. federal court admitted that. And since then, there have been really good reports by Mexican investigative journalists, especially a website I highly recommend called Contralinea. And they showed this network of corruption linked to drug cartels and such, headed by Felipe Calderon, the right-wing former president who allegedly stole the election in 2006. So AMLO has been a victim of the systematic corruption in the Mexican electoral system, which is why he has been trying to pass electoral reform. Now, if you listen to what the US corporate media says, it's like they're living on another planet. AMLO and his government is trying to save Mexican democracy to prevent the kind of corrupt right-wing neoliberal oligarchs who are linked to drug trafficking from continuing to steal elections like they did for so many years. And yet, the US media and the US government are claiming that AMLO is supposedly a dictator who is supposedly trying to destroy Mexican democracy. It's literally the opposite. The Washington Post editorial board, this is the voice of the oligarchy. The Washington Post belongs to, it is owned by, it's the personal property of Jeff Bezos, the world's richest human being, the founder of Amazon, who himself, his companies have billions of dollars of contracts with the US government, including with the CIA. The Washington Post editorial board published a ridiculous article claiming, quote, Mexico's young democracy teeters on the edge of a cliff. And they claim that AMLO's electoral law it is a knife stabbing at the heart of Mexico's democracy. It's ridiculous. It's literally the exact opposite. He's trying to save Mexican democracy, but he's trying to save Mexican democracy from the corrupt right-wing corporate oligarchs in Mexico that have dominated for decades. And the US government wants those corrupt right-wing oligarchs to continue to run Mexico so the US and US corporations can basically control Mexico as a colony in the Monroe Doctrine. That is why they're so angry about this. Another ridiculous piece of propaganda was published by The Atlantic magazine, the voice of the Washington, D.C. Political class, the establishment in Washington. And this was written by the U.S. war criminal David Frum. He was a speechwriter for U.S. President George W. Bush, and he was an accomplice in the Iraq War and the illegal criminal invasion of Iraq. Even the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, he said very clearly that the U.S. invasion of Iraq was illegal and breached the UN Charter. There's no question denying that. And David Frum was an accomplice in those war crimes. And yet he had the temerity to write this article demonizing what he called, quote, the autocrat next door. And he said, liberal democracy in Mexico is under assault. Worse, the attacker is the country's own president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. I mean, ridiculous propaganda. He refers to AMLO as Mexico's erratic and authoritarian president. Ridiculous propaganda. Again, he's the most popular president in modern Mexican history. He's way more popular than the Western so-called democratic leaders, according to polls from US-based polling firms. 2/3 of Mexicans have consistently supported AMLO. And yet, the US media wants to convince Mexicans that they're so stupid, they're so dumb, supposedly, this racist propaganda, that they don't understand that they're democratically elected president who's going to be in power for one term. He's not trying to change the term limits. He's going to be in power for one term and he's stepping down. And yet, the US media is claiming he's a dictator. It's insane propaganda. While the US media supports US puppet dictators around the world. And David Frum claims that AMLO is trying to end his country's commitment to multi-party liberal democracy. It's not multi-party democracy. Mexico was governed by one party from 1929 until 2000. One party. And then it had another right-wing party come into power from 2000 and 2012. And then from 2012 to 2018, it was once again the PRI party that governed for 70 years. Mexico was a one-party dictatorship, and then it became a two-party dictatorship, and it was run by the neoliberal corporate oligarchy. And AMLO is the first president since 1929 to break that bipartisan dictatorship. It was not a multi-party liberal democracy, just like the U.S. is not a multi-party liberal democracy. The U.S. is a bipartisan dictatorship with two factions of one right-wing corporate neoliberal oligarch party, imperialist warmongering party, like Mexico was until AMLO became president. David Frum, this war criminal, claims that Mexico is subverting the institutions that have upheld Mexico's democratic achievement. Above all, the country's admired and independent election system. Who in the world admires Mexico's election system? That's why the vast majority of Mexicans, over 90% of Mexicans, want electoral reform, because they know that it is not truly independent. It is a deeply institutionally corrupt system. That's why they support AMLO's electoral reform. And yet, the US media and war criminals in the US are trying to convince us that the Mexican electoral system is the embodiment of democracy. It is truly dystopian. I mean, they live on another planet. This propaganda is absurd. Other media outlets had the same propaganda, basically. Reuters, which has historically been funded by the British government, it's a mouthpiece of the British ruling class, they published an article citing anonymous critics. It's a classic example of media propaganda. They just say anonymous critics warn that AMLO's electoral reform will weaken democracy. No evidence. They just say critics warn. So this is why López Obrador was speaking out in that press conference against U.S. meddling, against the State Department trying to control Mexican politics, criticizing the U.S. media and newspapers like the Wall Street Journal for being mouthpieces of the mafias of economic power.
Porque este periódico y otros en Estados Unidos protegen a las mafias de poder económico en el mundo.
The United States government and corporate media outlets are treating Mexico like a colony. They do not want Mexico to have an independent political system that's truly democratic because they know that the majority of Mexicans want to continue having a leftist president who will invest in social programs and increase the minimum wage and invest in healthcare and education and nationalize Mexico's natural resources, not privatize it and sell it off. The US-backed neoliberal president, Enrique Peña Nieto, who hired the Colombian hacker to steal the 2012 election, he privatized Mexico's oil reserves, and AMLO renationalized those oil reserves. That's why the US corporate oligarchy, US capitalists, are trying to prevent the left from maintaining power in Mexico. They want a corrupt electoral system in Mexico that helps the right-wing oligarchs steal the elections like they did for so many years. So this is just a very blatant information warfare campaign, psychological warfare campaign to convince people that Mexico's popular elected president, with support from 2/3 of Mexicans, the most popular leader in decades, is trying to destroy democracy and trying to convince us that the right-wing corporate oligarchs who serve Mexico's capitalist class, who are closely linked to drug cartels and drug lords, like Felipe Calderon, like Vicente Fox, like Enrique Peña Nieto, these corrupt capitalists, they're trying to convince us that they're the ones defending democracy. And why? Because they're the ones who serve the interests of US corporations and the US capitalist class and US imperialism in the region. Because for the US empire, for US imperialism, democracy, in scare quotes, means that the country follows US orders, privatizes its natural resources, sells off its country to US corporations, cuts the minimum wage, cuts worker protections, attacks unions, prevents socialism from ever being able to take power, illegalizes socialism. That form of authoritarianism, of right-wing neoliberal capitalist authoritarianism, is what the US defines as democracy and US corporate media outlets define as democracy. And that is AMLO's great supposed crime, is opposing that. So with that said, I'm going to conclude here. This is Geopolitical Economy Report. I'm Ben Norton. Thank you so much for watching or listening.